This article is about the war on inflation by Marxist economist Michael Roberts. The Russian invasion of Ukraine grinds agonizingly on, with more dying and displaced and with further destruction of Ukrainian cities, farms, and homes. Back in the major economies, there is another war brewing, the war on inflation. Inflation of consumer prices are now at 30 to 40-year highs, with more to come. The COVID pandemic slump and now the Ukraine conflict has driven energy and food prices up to record highs. The war in Ukraine has gone global. Spiking commodity prices are on track to see their sharpest rises since 1970, sending a shockwave of suffering around the globe. As we see prices of essential goods every human needs to survive are surging upwards. Wheat prices are up by 60% since February. Food prices are now higher than during the global food crisis of 2008, which pushed 155 million people into extreme poverty. And the price inflation in these key areas has migrated into general price increase. Annual consumer price inflation, or CPI, now stands at 7.9% in the US, 5.9% in the Eurozone, 6.2% in the UK, and even Japan, long a deflating economy, now has an inflation rate of 1%. In the so-called emerging countries, inflation is even worse. India's at 6.2%, Russia at 9.2%, Brazil at 10.5%, Argentina at 52%, and Turkey at 54%. The battle is now to reduce and control inflation, and is being led by the central banks of the major economies. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. It is the primary job of central banks to control price inflation, not to sustain employment and economic growth. They are secondary. As Jay Powell puts it, the ultimate responsibility for price stability rests with the Federal Reserve. That's because inflation is the main enemy of the banking system. Creditors and lenders of money lose out if inflation rises, while debtors and borrowers gain. And central banks were created to support the financial sector and its profitability, and not much else. And indeed, there is not much else they can do. Michael Roberts has shown us in many previous articles the evidence that central banks have little control over the real economy. This is in capitalist countries, and that includes any inflation of prices in goods or services. For the 30 years of general price disinflation, where prices rise slow or even deflate, central banks have struggled to meet their usual 2% annual inflation target with their usual weapons of interest rates and monetary injections. And it'll be the same story in trying this time to reduce inflation rates. All the central banks were caught napping as inflation rates soared. And why was this? In general, because the capitalist mode of production does not move in a steady, harmonious and planned way, but instead in a jerky, uneven of booms and slumps. But specifically how? Because as Fed Chair Jerome Powell put it in a keynote speech to the National Association of Business Economists last week, why have forecasts been so far off? In my view, an important part of the explanation is that forecasters widely underestimated the severity and persistence of supply-side frictions, which, when combined with strong demand, especially for durable goods, produced surprisingly high inflation. Indeed, Michael Roberts in previous posts has argued that, contrary to the view of the Keynesians, the current inflation burst is not due to excessive demand or excessive wage increases, but due to the failure of supply and production. As Powell also puts it, contrary to expectations, COVID has not gone away with the arrival of vaccines. In fact, we are now headed once again into more COVID-related supply disruptions from China. It continues to seem likely that hope for supply-side healing will come over time as the world ultimately settles into some new normal, but the timing and scope of that relief are highly uncertain. This poses an intractable problem for the banks in their quest to protect bank profits. Their monetary weapons will prove useless in this war of inflation. Powell said that we have the necessary tools and we will use them to restore price stability. But does he? As Andrew Bailey, governor of the Bank of England, said, monetary policy will not increase the supply of semiconductor chips, it will not increase the amount of wind, no really, and nor will it produce more HGV drivers. If rising inflation is being driven by a weak supply side rather than an excessively strong demand side, monetary policy won't work. Monetary policy supposedly works by trying to raise or lower aggregate demand, to use the Keynesian category. If spending is growing too fast for production to meet it and so generating inflation, Higher interest rates supposedly dampened the willingness of companies and households to consume or invest by increasing the cost of borrowing. But even if this theory was correct, and the evidence does not really support it much, it does not apply when prices are rising because supply chains are broken. Energy prices are increasing or there are labor shortages. Nevertheless, central banks have only the monetary weapon to apply to accelerating inflation. So the Fed plans a sharp rise in its policy rate of interest, which sets the floor for all borrowing in capitalist markets, and so do other central banks. Powell aims to hike the federal funds rate to about 1.9% by the end of this year, and thus rising above its estimated longer-run normal value by 2023. At the same time, the Fed is pivoting on its previous program on quantitative easing, i.e. buying government and government-backed bonds through an increase in money supply. During the 21st century, the Fed has bought so much government paper that its balance sheet has jumped from 1 trillion to nearly 9 trillion, more than doubling during the COVID pandemic. Now the Fed is going to reduce the total amount on the balance sheet. Powell claims that these policy actions and those to come will help bring inflation down to near 2% over the next 3 years. Indeed, there is optimism in mainstream economics that increased interest rates and a reverse of monetary injections and other central banks will not only kill inflation, but also avoid a slump in investment and consumption as a result, as long as the Feds get on with the war on inflation and ends its policy of appeasement. Powell commented that the historical records provide some grounds for optimism. Soft, or at least softish, landings have been relatively common in US monetary history. In 3 episodes in 1965, 1984 and 1994. The Fed raised the federal funds rate significantly in response to perceived overheating without precipitating a recession. Powell also made much of the current mainstream explanation of inflation. That is, it's mainly caused by expectations of price rises gaining traction among consumers and businesses. Self-fulfilling, if you like. In the recent period, short-term inflation expectations have, of course, risen with inflation, but longer-run expectations remain well anchored in the historical ranges. The psychological explanation of inflation removes any objective analysis of price formation. Why should expectations rise or fall in the first place? And as I mentioned before, the evidence supporting the role of expectations is weak. As a new paper by Jeremy Rudd at the Federal Reserve concludes, economists and economic policymakers believe that households and firms' expectations of future inflation are a key determinant of actual inflation. A review of the relevant theoretical and empirical literature suggests that this belief rests on extremely shaky foundations, and a case is made that adhering to it uncritically could easily lead to serious policy errors. Powell significantly left out his soft recessions, the 2 deepest and widest slumps in the major capitalist economies since 1945, namely 1980 and 82 and the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, when interest rates rose sharply prior to the start of recession. In doing so, he cannot offer an explanation of why tighter monetary policy can have soft landings. What is missing from any explanation that there are 2 things that Marxist theory offers? First, what is happening to the profitability of capital, and second, what is happening to the real rate of interest. In periods where average profitability is high and or rising, then interest rates can and will rise too, but without crushing investment, so both productive and unproductive real estate and, say, finance. That wasn't the case in all the soft landing cases cited by Powell. It was also the case in another optimistic argument for the likely success of monetary policy in controlling inflation. One analyst claims that 1946 to 48 period is the best historical parallel to now. There were then serious supply shortages, then leading to sharp rises in price inflation. But eventually price increases slowed as supply came on board as manufacturing switched from military to civil production. The Fed did not have to hike interest rates, but just applied a relatively mild reduction in credit growth to shrink its balance sheet. In other words, the market's invisible hand worked. But this explanation again fails to note the average profitability of capital in this period was at 20th century highs, with labor cheap and unused technology to be applied. No wonder supply came on board quickly to douse the flames of inflation. But that was not the situation in 1980. After the huge profitability crisis that began from the mid-1960s and was exacerbated by the international slump of 1974 to 75, it was not that case in 2008-2009, where the profitability of productive capital was not much higher than than in the early 1980s, and much lower than in the 1946 to 64 golden age of capitalist production, or even the neoliberal recovery period of the 1980s and 90s. Then there is the second factor, the real rate of interest. Paul Volcker became head of the Federal Reserve in 1979 when inflation rates, triggered by high oil prices and tight labor markets, capping supply adjustment, unlike 1948, had reached 20th century highs. Volcker, a convinced monetarist and strong advocate of the interest of bankers, immediately hiked interest rates to such levels that real Fed fund interest rate jumped from -3% to +5%. You can see that jump. The shock hit to borrowing costs in real terms, coupled with the very low profitability of capital, caused the deepest post-war slump in the major capitalist economies. 2 bouts over 3 years. It was the end of manufacturing jobs in the US, Western Europe, and the UK. Productive capital moved to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Indeed, it was the slump that killed inflation and brought down oil prices, not rising interest rates. Instead of a soft landing as Jay Powell hopes for, Goldman Sachs analyst Philip Hildebrand reckons stagflation risk is a real concern today. We're looking at a supply shock layered on top of a supply shock, and the nature of the new supply shock centered on energy suggests not only that inflation will move even higher and likely prove more persistent moving forward, but also that growth will take a hit. There is an alternative to monetary policy. It is to boost investment and production through public investment. That would solve the supply shock. But sufficient public investment to do that will require significant control of the major sectors of the economy, particularly energy and agriculture, and coordinated action globally. That is currently a pipe dream. Instead, governments are looking to cut back investment in productive sectors and boost military spending to fight the war against Russia, and potentially China next. Which way will it go? Will Powell, Draghi, and Bailey be mini Volckers? Or will they step back from the conflict and opt for fewer rate hikes and be forced to live with higher inflation? Either way, it suggests that inflation globally will not subside until a new slump emerges, signaling that the central bank's war on inflation has been lost.